sprints, fires, and penalty points. This week we are chatting all about the Chinese Grand Prix, so get ready because you've been summoned to the Steward's office. Hello everyone and welcome back to the Steward's office. I'm Saira and this week F1 headed out to the Shanghai International Circuit for not only a Grand Prix, but also our first sprint weekend of 2025. 2 races in, and F1 is already giving us a sprint race, which I thought was pretty interesting to do. That is the way that the calendar fell, though, and yeah, after only 1 race out in Australia, which was not the most straightforward, the drivers, and 6 of them being rookies, headed out to China for a sprint weekend, and sprints mean that we only ever get 1 free practice session. So there was a lot going on. But before we get into the results and what happened on the weekend, let's chat about 2 bits of news that we kind of had coming out this weekend, right? So in the run-up to the Chinese Grand Prix, pretty much straight after the Australian Grand Prix, we found out that the FIA was basically going to be carrying out some more stringent load testing on the rear wings, clamping down on some of the flexi wings mini DRS allegations that have been going on around the paddock. And that was being put in place for China. They weren't giving the teams a lot of warning about this. They wanted to clamp down on it ASAP. So that was coming into place. That's the first bit of news. And then the second bit is the fact that Stefano Domenicali was in Thailand to have a chat about having a Grand Prix out in Thailand. It'd be really interesting to have a different country added to the Grand Prix calendar. As far as I know, we've never raced in Thailand before. So we will see where that goes. We'll keep a track on if there's any movement with that. It won't be the quickest thing. I don't know whether Thailand has a track that they could repurpose and make it an FIA top grade circuit for F1. Or whether it's also something that they'd want to build from scratch, whether it would be a street circuit or whether it would be a permanent one. But that is the chat that's going on right now. And I think the fact that Stefano Domenicali has opted to go out to Thailand to hold those talks sounds really promising. It's not just hearsay. We've seen the photos of Domenicali out there. Like I said, though, I think it'd be exciting to have a different country host an F1 race, and I'm sure Alex Albon would absolutely love it because he's the only driver on the grid that races under the Thai flag. So we will keep up to date with that and see what happens there. But let's get into the actual race weekend and what happened. And like I said, being a sprint weekend, we get such limited running for the drivers to figure out what they want out of their car and their setup. It's 1 free practice session. And we don't really get quali runs. It's a lot of long run data, which is understandable. That is what the teams are focusing on. So that means when we go into sprint quali in the second half of a Friday, right, it's always going to be a little bit interesting because you can't really get a proper read on what's going on. And I don't know whether it was that lack of running, potentially, that caused Liam Lawson to be kicked out in SQ1. It is the second qualifying in a row, whether it's qualifying properly or sprint qualifying, where he is exited in the first round, basically. Look, he's beaten himself up about it. I've heard his post-race and post-qualifying interviews, and he's not happy with it. But it can't bode well for Red Bull right now either when he's starting that far back on the grid. So I don't know whether, it was just the lack of running that he's had out there. This isn't a circuit that he's very familiar with. Maybe that played into it, but yeah, he was an SQ1 exit. Also having a pretty bad sprint quali were the Alpines. Both of them, Jack Doohan and Pierre Gasly, ended up out in SQ1. So they really struggled. And like I said, all of this limited running, it's so hard to figure out what window you want your car in. And I think the main thing with China was tyre graining this weekend. It was such a hot topic for the drivers, and it was them really struggling to get their tyres in the right temperature throughout sprint quali and quali, and then during the sprint and the actual race, it was trying to manage that graining that they were getting. So I don't know for Alpine as well whether it was just trying to get their tyres in that right window and if the setup just wasn't suited towards that. But really disappointing that both of them ended out in SQ1. Gabriel Bortoleto, though, has managed to once again out-qualify Nico Hülkenberg. Nico Hülkenberg was out in SQ1. Gabriel Bortoleto made it up to SQ2. And considering that Nico Hülkenberg is known for his qualifying, past 2 years when he came back into Formula One, started with Haas again, His qualifyings were the highlight of the hard weekend, let's be honest. He managed to get that car up into Q3 at times where it had no business being, okay? That car didn't always have the best pace, but Hulkenberg managed to extract it. And I thought with this year and him moving to Sauber and having a rookie next to him, his strength would still once again be in qualifying, and maybe Portobello would struggle to keep up a little bit, not maybe vastly out-qualified by Nico Hulkenberg, but it would be a bit more of a struggle. What we have had, though, are 2 qualifyings now where he has actually managed to out-qualify his very experienced teammate. And I don't know whether that comes from a place of Hulkenberg obviously knowing the Haas car over the past 2 years, being really, really familiar with it, and maybe that adjustment moving to a new team, and the Sauber is not a great car, so he's gone into what is a worse car and he's having to learn how to handle that. And for Bortoleto, all he has is his F2 experience to lean on. And the cars are so vastly different that there's nothing that he's really comparing it to when it comes to an F1 car. So that might be actually working in his favour right now, considering how not great the Sauber is. Alex Albon had a wonderful qualifying. He ended up in SQ3, once again showing that the Williams does have some pace in it and he is extracting it. Carlos Sainz, on the other hand, not so lucky. But Alex is very used to the Williams car, how it behaves, how it works. And, you know, he's got a little bit more experience when it comes to where he might want that setup to be compared to Carlos, who, like Nico Hulkenberg, is moving to a different team. And Ferrari compared to the Williams, very different, let alone a different engine supplier, which does change things. SQ3 was quite interesting because the McLarens really struggled to pull a good lap together. They were a little bit scruffy throughout qualifying. It's not that they didn't have pace, but the car didn't seem all that put together at times. And what it ended up with is Lewis Hamilton taking pole position for the sprint race. In only his second qualifying with a Ferrari, he managed to get pole, and then we had Max Verstappen starting alongside him. So it did kind of feel like 2021, just with Lewis in a different team. But an incredible effort from Lewis. The car for him looked so much put together, and after a really awful weekend in Australia, this here in China at the sprint qualifying looked like the Lewis that we all wanted to see when he started with Ferrari. I think the setup for him was in a much better place. He spoke to his engineer about it a bit more. And China's a track that he just does so well out. He's got the most amount of poles there, the most amount of race wins. And I think that did play in its favour as well and help that confidence boost. The actual sprint race, though, really focused on tyre wear, like I mentioned before. Really focused on if you could keep your tyres in a good window, if you could keep some of your tyres back so they weren't sort of running out by the time you got to the end of the sprint. But for Lewis Hamilton, that was not an issue. He had just a commanding lead from start to finish in that race, right? At no point did it look like he was really under any pressure of losing the lead of the race. He managed his tyres well. I think he ended up winning with a gap of about 6 seconds, I want to say. But an absolute masterclass from Lewis Hamilton, you know. And he just looked so at one with the car. And I've mentioned Australia last week, and you know, the pace didn't always seem there. He didn't seem comfortable with it. But that sprint race, he just seemed like he was in his element. And it was amazing to see him cross that finish line first for his first win with a Ferrari. Further back, though, probably wasn't the most straightforward sprint for Max Verstappen because he was really struggling with tyre wear. The Red Bull didn't seem to be as nice on its tyres. And he did try and hold back Oscar Piastri. He went down with a fight, but Oscar did end up overtaking him with Max Verstappen, taking P3. Not a bad result, but yeah, I think tyre wear for him really was his undoing there. While Oscar finished in P2, though, the other McLaren of Lando Norris did not have the most straightforward sprint. Now, he ended up losing a couple of places during the start and then struggled to make it up from there. And once again, I think tyre grading causing an issue. Charles Leclerc also just couldn't seem to make his way up from where he qualified, which I think was P5. But it was a struggle for both of them. They couldn't make those moves. And Charles also in sprint quali had struggled, couldn't get a good lap together. And it did put him in the back foot going into the sprint. And Kick Sauber had a little bit of a nightmare. Nico Hulkenberg ended up starting from the pit lane because they'd made some changes to his car whilst they were in Parc Fermé. So that was not great because starting from the pit lane really puts you on the back foot. And then in the very last lap of the sprint, Bortoleto and Doohan end up making contact. Now, Bortoleto wasn't exactly right at the front or even in the middle of the field fighting for points, but still gutting for Kick Sauber. Jack Doohan did end up being put responsible for that contact. When you look at the videos, yeah, there's no two ways about that, and got a 10-second time penalty along with his first 2 penalty points of the 2025 season. Not great for Jack Doohan because he had an engine problem in FP1. The mechanics had to change his power unit, and then, like I said, got kicked out in SQ1. So not a great weekend so far for Doohan. But the sprint race in general gives us and the race engineers and the drivers a really good idea of the sort of setup they want to go into with the race, right? Lets them know if they're slightly on the right track or whether there's things that they want to change, especially when it comes to things like tyre graining. Is there something they can do with the setup that might offset that a little bit? And in a Grand Prix, which is much longer than the sprint, you want those tyres to last. And setup changes were made between the sprint and qualifying. And you could tell that because the results were quite different from what happened during sprint qualifying. Oscar Piastri ended up getting his first ever pole position in Formula 1. And I can't lie, I didn't realise that Oscar hadn't had a pole position in Formula 1 yet. He's had poles when it's come to sprint qualifying, but not in the actual qualifying session. So that was his first ever pole position. He put together an absolutely beautiful lap. The McLaren seemed a little bit more dialed in than they did in sprint qual. It didn't seem as scruffy and messy, so they definitely must have made a couple of adjustments there. Lando Norris was starting a little bit further back. I think he did struggle a little to get a good lap in, made a mistake on his last fast lap, and it didn't go as well for him. But starting next to Oscar Piastri, right, was George Russell. He was in P2, and that was not the car I was expecting to be in P2 at all, but like Oscar, put a really, really good lap in. What surprised me more, though, was the fact that after being on pole for the sprint and then winning the sprint, Lewis Hamilton qualified in P5. Now, he admitted himself that there were changes that were made to the car between the sprint and qualifying, and it ended up putting the car on the knife's edge. And I think that made it quite difficult for him to extract the sort of lap times that he was getting in previous sessions. A couple of other takeaways, though. It was another nightmare on qualifying for Jack Doohan and Liam Lawson, who didn't get out of Q1. And I didn't mention Lawson during the sprint, but look, he managed to make up a couple of spaces, managed to get a few overtakes in, but it wasn't anything drastic. He didn't end up near the points there, which is disappointing. But also in a sprint, I get it. It is hard. There are fewer laps. Graining was an issue with all of the cars. So I do get it that it wasn't going to be the most straightforward thing to do. But yeah, between being out in SQ1, no points in the sprint and not making up that many places, and then being out in Q1, I mean, for both those drivers, Jack Doohan and Liam Lawson, this was not great. And for Lawson in particular, he ended up qualifying in P20, the slowest of all the drivers. And look, he did say, I think it was one of the Alpines, potentially Gasly, that had impeded him. That's what he said. But, you know, in the post-qual interview, he said himself that's not a good enough excuse. He needed to do better. And I think part of the problem is trying to get a good enough banker lap in at some point during qualifying so that if you do get impeded, you've got something to fall back on. What was heartbreaking, though, in his post-quali interview was the fact that he turned around and said, yeah, I need more time, but I don't have more time. And that might be pressure that he's putting on himself, saying, like, I don't have enough time. I need to get up to scratch. I need to get some points on the board. Or whether there is a clause in his Red Bull contract. Now, I could genuinely believe that being the case because some drivers do have it. There are rumours that Jack Doohan has that clause. But either way, there is an immense amount of pressure on his shoulders. And you can tell that from the interviews that he's giving. And I don't know, for only being 2 races in, he already seems a little defeated, I guess. But with qualifying out of the way with it meant that we were ready for a race on Sunday. And I can't lie to you guys, right? I was a little disappointed in this race. I was underwhelmed by it, I think is the best word for me to use. I was underwhelmed. This wasn't an exciting race to me. And I think a lot of that came down to the fact that the drivers, understandably, were really focused on tyre graining and tyre wear. And so they weren't pushing as much, and there were gaps being left between all of the drivers, so they weren't getting caught up in dirty air and the tyres would deteriorate faster. But that meant that they wouldn't be in DRS and that we weren't seeing as many overtakes as I think we'd all like to see. And it wasn't the worst race that we've had. We did have some great overtakes at times, but just felt underwhelmed by it. What happened right at the front of the field, though, in that slight title fight that we might be seeing as the season goes on? Oscar Piastri had a brilliant race, was in control, kept his head down, kept calm, and led that race and won that race. He has won his first race for the 2025 F1 season. He really needed this comeback after the Australian Grand Prix when he went off the track and lost so many places, from being in P2 on a podium to ending up in P9. That he can now put behind him because he is a race winner in 2025 and it was absolutely brilliant from him. Our current championship leader, Lando Norris, didn't really manage to get in touch with Oscar Piastri to the point where he could try and overtake. I think there were points where he looked like he might be getting closer, but it was never really enough to battle for that win. And towards the end of the race, he had some problems with his brakes, and there was a point where his race engineer was like, this is critical, please be careful, because we were only in the last couple of laps. And they didn't want to lose P2. It was going to be a McLaren 1-2. It would have been great for the constructors. And championships aren't won by just winning races. They're won by finishing races in the points and being consistent. So that was going to be key for Lando Norris and will be key throughout the rest of the season if he's battling for a championship. The Mercedes of George Russell, though, once again showing that it does have pace, more pace than I was expecting. He managed to keep himself in P3 and take home his second podium of the season. I'm really curious what's going to happen with Mercedes, right? Because it is looking like there's pace there. I think Kimi Antonelli was further back, but he's also trying to learn the tracks and the cars, so we're giving him a pass. But on George's side, it does look like there's really good pace there. And then there's Max Verstappen, right, who had a couple of his own problems during this race because he ended up falling back a little bit at the start and then had to fight to make up those places again. And he did finish in P4. I'm sure he would have loved a podium, but to be fair, he said himself this weekend that the car was not great. The pace wasn't there. He wasn't expecting a win, but I think P4 is still a really good place to finish considering the fact that he wasn't happy with the car. Ferrari had, I wouldn't say issues, right? Strategy wasn't as big of a problem as it was in Australia, which I think we can all be thankful for, right? But I think the changes that were made to Lewis Hamilton's Ferrari really did not help him during the race. And to be fair, Charles Leclerc, who had a broken front wing after making contact with Hamilton in the first lap, seemed to have more pace. I don't understand, and I'm sure Ferrari are going to look into it. I hope they do look into that and figure out why that was the case and what they can do to improve their front wing if that is the case. But those changes did not help him. He was struggling, and there was a point where he was like, look, I haven't got the pace, I'm struggling, let Charles pass me, because Charles was right behind him, which I think about sums it up. So Charles Leclerc ended up in P5, Lewis Hamilton in P6, so a better result than Australia, but some question marks about what was going on with their pace because both of them struggled. Even when Charles overtook Lewis, he couldn't overtake George, and then Max Verstappen ended up overtaking him in the latter stages of the race. That midfield battle, though, and that midfield pack did get interesting at times. I'm going to kick off with the only DNF that we had, right? And that was Fernando Alonso, his second DNF in a row. At least he finished the sprint, right? But yes, he's yet to finish a Grand Prix in 2025 because his brakes were on fire. Thankfully, we didn't get a safety car, right? He did manage to get back to the pit lane and wheeled himself into the garage, or the mechanics wheeled him into the garage. But yeah, that was on lap 5, so he didn't make it very far into this GP before he had to retire. So Aston Martin were already one car down. We did get, though, both Haas's ending up in the points, which is incredible because I don't know if you guys have seen the interview that Ayo Komatsu has done about the Australian Grand Prix, but he basically turned around and said that they genuinely thought the car was broken in Australia because of how slow it was. That was concerning when he said that, but it seems that they've managed to find some pace in the car for China, and whether the slow pace in Australia was track specific or they just couldn't find the right setup window for the car, they can put that behind them because they do have double points. Esteban Ocon, quiet race. They didn't show him very much, right? But pitted at the right time, made the right overtakes, and managed to get a really good haul of points in for the team. But Ollie Behrman, my goodness, the overtakes he was making on track were beautiful. And there was one overtake in particular where, yes, he did lock up as he was trying to get past Lance Stroll, but all the other ones were just so clean and well executed. And he managed to get into P10. So 1 point, but for him and for Haas, that is definitely going to make them smile. And Ollie was another driver who had a nightmare in Australia. The race he managed to finish, but the sessions beforehand, the accidents, the crashes, the gearbox not working, it did put a lot of pressure on him. So to come into China and have a much cleaner race weekend is something that he should be super happy with and proud of. Carlos Sainz, though, he finished in P13, I think it was. Really just did not have a great weekend, not had a great race. In comparison to Alex Albon, who was managing to lead the race at one point because everyone around him had pitted, he hadn't, and he was leading the race for a while. But yeah, for Carlos, couldn't get closer than P13. If we look right at the back of the field, though, and I am coming back to Liam Lawson, who, yes, okay, he started from the pit lane first of all. They made some suspension changes to his car that broke parc ferme, right? But I think they were trying to find something that would work for him a little bit more in terms of setup. He managed to make up a couple of places, not a load, very much like the sprint, where he gets a few overtakes done, and I think he ended in P16 or 15, right? So it wasn't anything brilliant. And look, I think we can all agree the Red Bull does not have a great amount of pace at the moment, but he is struggling against some cars that I think we'd all expect him to be able to overtake. We did have Gabriel Bortoleto spinning on the first lap of the race, and that just made him lose so much time. I mean, he was like 44 seconds behind Nico Hülkenberg at one point. So not a great race for him either, and really gutted for him. I'm going to bring up Jack Doohan again. Lawson and Doohan have been brought up a lot, but Doohan I have another reason for bringing up here, because Jack Doohan ended up having an incident with Isaac Hadjar. He was deemed to have forced another driver off track, the driver being Isaac Hadjar, got a 10-second time penalty and another 2 penalty points. So he is up to 4 penalty points in one weekend, which is interesting, and I'm very curious what that conversation in Alpine is going to be like. But yeah, an absolute nightmare for him. I think he did lock up when, he was penalised for pushing Isaac Hadjar off track, but they still deem that as forcing another driver off track. It doesn't matter whether you locked up or not. And yep, 10-second penalty and another 2 penalty points on his super license. On the topic of Isaac Hadjar, though, right, VCARB opted for a 2-stop race. And Lewis Hamilton, I think, is the only other driver that did a 2-stopper. To be fair for Lewis Hamilton, he was about to be overtaken by Max Verstappen anyway. I don't think it was going to make much of a difference. I don't think it's a strategy blunder for Ferrari. He was going to be overtaken by Max and end up in P6, and that's where he finished. There was no net gain or net loss there, which is why I don't really count this as a strategy blunder from Ferrari. It probably made the race a little bit more comfortable for Lewis being on fresher tyres at least. So yeah, that was the other driver that did the 2-stopper. But going back to VCAB, right, they did a 2-stopper and it basically ruined their race because the cars around them weren't doing a 2-stopper. They all managed to make it last on a 1-stop strategy. And it did wreck their chances again in the points. They ended up with no points, and I think you can argue that because of that 2-stopper, Isaac Hadjar ended up towards the back near Jack Doohan, and that incident happened. So the blunder there from VCARB, definitely. I think they were counting on the cars around them to have that 2-stop strategy, and they just didn't opt to do it. They hung on to the tyres and it managed to work for them. But the other thing with VCARB is the fact that Yuki Tsunoda's front wing ended up breaking, and there wasn't any contact that he hadn't gone over a curb or anything. It just broke. There is something with the actual assembly of that front wing that wasn't quite right, and meant that Yuki ended up losing a lot of time on top of a 2-stop strategy that didn't work after qualifying quite well, after having a decent weekend so far. A strategy call and a manufacturing issue ruined his weekend. I am gutted for Yuki because he has been driving brilliantly, but there are just forces working against him at the Chinese Grand Prix, it seemed. Who are my winners and losers from this Grand Prix, though? And for my winners, I think I've got 3. I'm going to put down Oscar Piastri after winning the Grand Prix, after having an awful race in Australia. To come home and win the race was absolutely incredible and so well deserved. He drove such a brilliant race. My other winner, right, I know the race didn't go well for him, but it is Lewis Hamilton because of the sprint portion of the weekend. Now, firstly, I think it was a huge confidence boost for Lewis Hamilton, probably one that he did need a little bit coming into a new team, but just drove so well. And I think had it not been for some of the setup changes that they had made between the sprint and quali, the race could have potentially been quite different, but he just seemed more on form than everything that happened in Australia. You know, the car seemed better, he seemed more at one with it, and to take home a sprint pole and a sprint win, and it is his first sprint win, as well as Ferrari's first sprint win, I think is definitely something that should be celebrated, and that is why he is one of my winners. My other winner of the weekend, though, isn't someone who actually won any of the races, but it is Ollie Behrman. Like I mentioned, guys, those overtakes were amazing to watch. He made his way through the field really cleanly, and considering some of the incidents that we've had from some of the other rookies, he's doing very well, and he did really, really well over the Chinese Grand Prix to bounce back from what was a difficult weekend in Australia. All 3 of them did not have a great time, and for Ollie, it's hard not to be hard on yourself when things like that happen, you know, the accidents and everything, but to come back, drive that clean race, and bring home another point for Haas is really, really good to see. So he is my 3rd winner of the Chinese Grand Prix. Losers, though, I have 3 of them. And the first one I will start off with is Fernando Alonso, because I'm just gutted for him, guys. 5 laps in, brakes on fire, having to retire from the race is it's disappointing for him and for the team. You know, to DNF in Australia, to DNF now, I mean, I'm hoping the Japanese Grand Prix brings him some more luck, but we will wait and see. But I can't imagine how good he's feeling after that as well. So he is one of my losers at least. And then my other 2 drivers, I don't think should be a surprise to you guys, considering how much I've spoken about them this podcast episode. And they are 2 rookies, and they are Liam Lawson and Jack Doohan. And I don't think I could have left them off this list, really, because it has been a rough weekend for them. Let's kick off with Jack Doohan, right? Out in SQ1, out in Q1, an incident in the sprint and an incident in the race. 4 penalty points and then accumulated 20 seconds worth of penalties. That's a lot for one weekend. I think we can all agree with that. And obviously having the sprint doesn't help. It, means it's more likely that you can get penalty points and everything. But if the rumours are to be believed that his seat is at risk if he doesn't perform, this isn't going to help. And if those rumours are true, I can't imagine mentally what that's doing. Because even if they're not, the amount of conversation that's been had about Franco Colapinto potentially replacing him, it's going to affect you in some way or the other. And maybe that is what's causing some of the problems that he's having. But it was quite a bad weekend for him. I would not want to be in his shoes right now, chatting to Flavio Briatore or Oliver Oakes. But I think conversations will be had there because there are things that need to be improved. Liam Lawson, though, I mean, yes, it has not been good. And the media has spoken a lot about Liam Lawson, considering we're only 2 races into the season. But obviously Australia did not go well, didn't qualify into Q2 or Q3, and then DNF'd in the race. And then we come to China, he's out in SQ1, he is out in Q1, and then doesn't get any of the points in the sprint or in the race. I don't really know what Red Bull's plan is here. I don't know what they want to do. You would think that they want to give him a little bit more time at least, because 2 races is not a lot, considering that this was a sprint weekend as well. You'd hope they'd give him a handful more races to get used to the car and everything. Whether they do or not, I don't know. Red Bull could opt to swap him out. I think Autosport, right, before I started recording this podcast episode, on Instagram I saw a post where Autosport understands that there's a chance that they could replace him or do a swap between him and Yuki as early as the Japanese Grand Prix, which is 2 weeks away. That's nothing. So they would have only given him 2 races in the Red Bull before swapping him out. I'm not inclined to believe it right now, because 2 races to acclimatise to a brand new car seems crazy to me. Once again, we can all agree that improvements do need to be made there, because it's rough watching it more than anything, and seeing how disappointed he is as well with what has gone on during this race is not great. And not just this race, but qualies and sprints and everything that happened last weekend as well. He's really not happy, and like I said, just seems a little bit defeated. So those are my other 2 losers for this race. And like, I want to see the rookies do well, I really do, and I'm hoping Japan is a lot better for them. But I do think Jack Doohan and Liam Lawson are 2 drivers that have the most pressure on them, in terms of the fact that it seems like there are people peering over their shoulders for that seat. There seems to be some pressure from their teams to perform very well straight from the off. I think Kimi Antonelli, Ollie Behrman, Isaac Hadjar, one have been performing quite well. I mean, I know Ollie had some issues in Australia, but still. But also have teams that seem to be quite supportive of them. And with Jack and Liam, it feels like there is a lot more pressure coming from their teams there. Now, I was about to finish off this episode, but I got a notification on my phone that a new FIA document had been released. So, quick update on that, and then we'll finish off this podcast episode. But it looks like there are 2 cars that are underweight from the Chinese Grand Prix after the post-race weighing of the cars. And it looks like it's car number 10 and car number 16, which is Charles Leclerc in 16 and Pierre Gasly in 10, 1 kilogram underweight. Now, with Charles, he did have a broken end plate on his front wing. They are allowed to replace that like for like before they go to weigh the cars. But if they have changed that, if they have swapped the front wing out for one that is whole and it's still 1 kilogram underweight, we are going to have issues. And with Pierre Gasly, I don't think that there was anything wrong with the car as far as I know. Normally an underweight car means disqualification, so that's not great, guys. I will keep an eye on that and we'll see what happens. But a disqualification for Alpine and Ferrari is not going to help their days after the races that they've had. But that is all for this race weekend. There is a break next weekend, and then we head out to Japan for the Japanese Grand Prix way earlier than we normally do it. It's normally in the second half of the season. But I think this should mean that we have less of a chance of rain out in Japan, which would be very nice to see. So I will be back then. Thank you guys so much for listening, and diolch yn fawr. Make sure you go and find me on Instagram and TikTok. I post a whole load of other motorsport content there about some of the technical directives, about some history on Formula One and everything. I'm at Stewards_office there, and I will see you guys the next time you're summoned to the Stewards office.